Austria, because Marie Antoinette was Austrian. And they were captured and brought back, and then, of course, put on trial for treason. And as you know, they end up, both of them, with their heads cut off. The guillotine, the national razor, which has made its appearance on stage. Now, the Republic is what we think of when we think of the radical phase. So the king loses his head. The National Assembly renames itself the National Convention. Not everybody wanted the king to lose his head. Remember, the Girondins, who represented the provincial areas, were not for killing the king, whereas the Jacobins, the sort of urban Parisian revolutionaries, did want him to lose his head. So it is important to know. Oh, and I should say that at this time they were also at war with monarchies that surrounded them, England and Austria and Prussia. And so there really was very real worry that if any of these countries was able to topple the revolutionaries, they would reinstate the king. And so there was this need to kill the king, because if he was killed, then Prussia, Austria, and England couldn't force the revolutionaries to put a king back on the throne. That's why the children are killed too. But during this radical phase, the National Convention gets very, very paranoid. And rightly so, perhaps. They face these external threats, these three countries, and they also face these internal threats. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of the peasants living in the provinces who were deeply religious, they were not very happy about having their priests carted off. They were not very happy about having their king killed, and so there were uprisings. And in the Vendée alone, where there was civil war, 100,000 of these anti-revolutionaries were killed. Areas like Lyon. So we don't have a united country during this radical phase where there's a lot of death and a lot of people being sent to the guillotine. We see paranoia sort of at its worst. Now, during this radical time, at one point, there's such a real fear of the external and internal threats at the same time that the National Convention disbands, and they have 12 men remain as this Committee of Public Safety, an emergency government that really can do as it pleases, a 12-man dictatorship, if you will, and it's meant to safeguard the revolution, and it was never intended to be a permanent thing. Now, the CPS, the Committee of Public Safety, is very radical. They think that if they want to win this revolution, they need to wean the people off of Catholicism. So they really do start this, especially Saint Just and Hébert. They start this very sort of scary sort of reign of de-Christianization. Remember, this is when they introduce the 10-day calendar so that people don't know what day is Sunday. And this is when they get rid of streets that have the name saint in them. And this is when they start calling each other citoyen, citizen. And this is where you're killed if you speak out against these revolutionaries. And Robespierre takes it a little bit too far. Remember, we read the document in your source book, The Republic of Virtue. Remember, he really did want to force everybody in France to be a civic participant, and it wasn't enough to just sit back. You had to be an active supporter of this revolutionary government, and he wanted to use terror to scare people straight, to get people to really support this revolution. And so it is during this sort of horrible great terror that people get sickened. People don't like this anymore. You can see why over in England, Edmund Burke writes about these revolutionaries as if they're animals, this anarchy that's descended, and a lot of cartoons in England showing the sans-culottes, these Paris revolutionaries who were called the sans-culottes, the without pants, because they didn't wear the noble knee breeches. They were proud to be artisans and workers. The British press mocking them, having these men without pants sitting around sort of gorging on bodies and the like, and asking, are these the rights of man? Is this what the Enlightenment gets you? And so really the revolution did go too far during this radical phase. And so when no one else really knew what to do about it, and Robespierre had a list of enemies of the state, and everybody was afraid that it might be them by this point, they arrested him before he could arrest anybody else. And remember, he ultimately has his head cut off too. So then we get the reactionary phase of the revolution, the Directory, a 5-man directors up at the top with a council of elders and a council of 200. And this is the Thermidorian reaction. The new calendar, Thermidor, is July. And so this Thermidorian reaction, which really was an attempt to go back to a little bit the way things were before, reopen the Catholic Church, bring back priests, close the Jacobin clubs, to try to be a little bit more moderate. But the Directory wasn't really liked by either the right or the left, and so it was unpopular, and it was nervous about uprisings, and it invited Napoleon in 1799 to come and defend it, and Napoleon just came in instead and staged a coup d'etat, and it was very easy for him to do. Now, Napoleon, when he takes control, ultimately becoming emperor in 1803, emperor for life, he will reign until 1814. As you know, the 1815 Congress of Vienna will end the Napoleonic Wars that he plays a role in. But during his reign, he is in many, many ways an enlightened ruler. He takes the French revolutionary sort of enlightened ideas and carries them with him wherever he goes when he's taking over different parts of Europe. And some of the things that the revolutionaries did were wonderful. They made Jews citizens of France is the first country to make Jews citizens. I think they do it in 1793, it's 1792 or 1793. They outlaw slavery in the French colonies. That's a good thing. So they're doing some good things, but they're also sending people to the national razor, left, right, and center, and that's not a good thing. All right, so when Napoleon comes to power, he is in many ways enlightened. He has a Napoleonic code. He wants all people equal before the eyes of the law. So the pre-revolutionary days where if you were a noble, you got different treatment than if you were a peasant, gone. If you commit a crime, whether you're a noble or a rich person, I should say, or whether you're a poor person, it doesn't matter. Equality before the law. That Napoleonic code is very important. He makes a deal with the Catholic Church, the Concordat of 1801, whereby he recognizes Catholicism as the state religion. Remember, the majority of Frenchmen are Catholic, but he also argues for toleration. He's tolerant of all religions, including Jews. So Judaism. So he is tolerant on that front too. He's enlightened on that front too. He listens to Voltaire. So I think that's important. He does make a deal with the Pope that the Pope is the only person who can name French bishops, but Napoleon's the one who comes up with the list, and the Pope has to pick somebody from the list. So, you know, he's also kind of keeping his power. And when he is crowned emperor, remember, he doesn't let the Pope put the crown on his head. He takes it from the Pope. He's crowning himself. He doesn't want to be beholden to anybody. So I think that's important to say too. The Legion of Honor, remember, is the award that's given to somebody who serves France in an administrative capacity or in a military capacity. And again, this is by merit, not birth. So this award that still remains today, the Legion of Honor, you know, it's your ability that gets you that award. So that's a very enlightened thing. School. Real push on school. Napoleon sets up schools from preschool all the way through a university of France. And so it seems to me, a very sort of Enlightenment thing. You keep going through school according to ability if you pass your tests. So again, it's not birth, it's ability that gets you that gets you continuing education. And you know, the bank, he does balance the budget, and so the bank isn't particularly, say, an enlightened sort of, the Bank of France isn't necessarily in and of itself enlightened, but I do think it's important to point out that everybody in France now is paying taxes. Everybody, not just, you know, the third estate. Everybody is paying fair taxes. And so you really do see a lot of sort of Enlightenment influence here in Napoleon's reign, but in a couple of ways he's not enlightened. Perhaps the biggest way, well, I don't know about the biggest way, but he's not good with women. Now, we already know that women didn't get too much out of the revolution, but under Napoleon, they're not even allowed to make contracts, and they can't own land. And the Napoleonic Code itself is patriarchal. Women belong to their fathers until they belong to their husbands, and he is pretty firm about this. So women get nothing. Nothing from this. He's not enlightened when it comes to his rule. I mean, he takes his rule and he won't give it up. And so I think that in and of itself, you know, making yourself emperor. Remember, first he's council, one of three, and then he's, you know, council for life, and then he's the emperor, and that's not very enlightened. You could argue. he also puts nepotism. He puts family on thrones throughout Europe, and his brother on the throne of Spain is particularly unpopular. As you know, it leads to that 3rd of May, the uprising that Goya sort of commemorated, and is something that I want you to know. Where clearly, from the Spanish viewpoint, we have we have one of the men rising up against Napoleonic rule, pictured like Christ in that white, with the stigmata on their hands, being shot by those, those almost machine-like French Napoleonic soldiers. So that's not very enlightened. And he also reinstates slavery. He tries to reinstate slavery in the French colonies. It's not successful. There's an insurrection, but nevertheless, he's not good when it comes to people of color. So in some ways, he's not enlightened, but in other ways, he is. This is important because maybe you'll get a DBQ with just sources on Napoleon, and they might ask you to what extent is he enlightened. And so in many ways, he is, but women and Jews and people of color, no, not so much. And also in terms of taking power, I think. But Napoleon does carry the Napoleonic Code throughout Europe as he takes over different areas. And so just taking these Enlightenment ideas further, I think, is important. Now, he fails not because of his domestic policy. Napoleon, he was very popular. His domestic policy was popular. He fails because of his foreign policy. His continental system was a disaster for Europe. He thought that he could starve Britain into submission, but basically Britain just was able to trade, remember, with the New World, and it was continental Europe that struggled not having Britain as a trading partner. So that didn't really work. The Peninsular Wars were with Spain. That didn't really work. And then he went into Russia, and remember, it's never a good idea to go to Russia. It's cold, and the Russians are kind of ruthless. Their scorched earth policy means that there's not going to be anything for you to eat when you get there. And so really it's his domestic policy, not his domestic policy. It's his foreign policy that ends up really, that he overextends his abilities, I guess. And he is, of course, as you know, in 1815, the Congress of Vienna, which is a very sort of conservative document, architected, remember, by Metternich, will try to put the world back, Europe back to the way it was before the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Remember, with Bourbon monarchs back on the throne in Italy and Sicily and Spain and France and the like. And we'll talk about that next class, but just to remind you of that. All right, so let's see. So the Enlightenment had huge consequences for a lot of different things, I think, that you kind of need to think broadly. You've written your Jews over time, anti-Semitism over time, so you know the Enlightenment played a big role in opening up some opportunities for Jews in particularly Austria and France. Prussia is reluctant, and so just keep that in mind. And that also reminds me that we didn't do Catherine. So Catherine is another enlightened ruler of Russia, remember? And, or did we do, I get confused when I do these because I'm not working from a script, but it doesn't hurt to do her again. If I already did her, just ignore me. But Catherine the Great of Russia, friends with Voltaire, she publishes, I think I did. She published that encyclopedia and abolished torture, but she was not good when it came to Jews in the Pale of the Settlement. Remember, Poland is split in a balance of power move between Austria and Russia and Prussia, and she forces many Jews in the 1790s to go live in inhospitable areas, so to speak. And remember, she would have been good to the serfs, but in 1773, those serfs rose up against her, the Pugachev rebellion. So sorry about that. I forgot that I had done her. All right. But anyway, so out of the Enlightenment, we have political change. We have enlightened monarchs, and you do need to be able to give a couple of ways in which they are enlightened and maybe ways in which they're not. We haven't gotten to, the modern idea of enlightenment yet, but we also have the French Revolution and Napoleon. So that's a carry-on of some Enlightenment ideas. Children, things change for children because Rousseau also writes not just the social contract, but he wrote Emile, remember? And he wrote about children, and he didn't like children being raised as little adults. He didn't like kids wearing those whalebone corsets and dressed like adults and not given a lot of affection. And he thought the cold intellectualism he didn't like. He wanted kids out in nature, being spontaneous and curious and investigating things and getting dirty and wearing comfortable clothes. But he only goes so far as an Enlightenment thinker in that he is not, he's not arguing anything for women other than little girls should be raised to be good housewives or good in the domestic sphere, whereas boys should be, being raised to be good in the public sphere. And so he does see a separation of the sexes very distinctly. Again, the Enlightenment is very much a male movement. But two women that were very influenced by the French Revolution were Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges. Both women, Olympe de Gouges writes The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was which was sort of copied word for word with Roman numerals and all the rest of it from the National Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man. And then, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Both women thought that women should be educated. Both women thought that women should be given greater voice in society, for sure. And so we do see some, exceptional women breaking out a little bit. But overall, when we think of the Enlightenment, we think of it as a male sort of movement. And nowhere, remember, is that more sort of obvious than when we look at David's painting, The Oath of the Hirashi, where the men, remember, are taking action. They're going to go and win the war. And remember, the women are kind of weeping in the corner in the background. Remember, we looked at that, and the women are all curves and all their eyes are closed and they're slumped and they're in despair, but the men are active and their eyes are open and they're going to go out there and change the world, so to speak. So we really do see this as a male movement. The art of this time period is the neoclassical art. And remember, I wanted you to know Joseph Wright of Derby, things like the Professor at the Orrery, or the Bell Jar, that one, or remember with the cockatoo that is in the bell jar, and when the man closes off the oxygen, the cockatoo will die. And remember, the orrery is the one where it's the solar system set up. And remember, in that painting, we actually have a light source, which is supposed to be the sun. But this is also a painting about the Enlightenment, brightening everybody's minds, waking people up. And light and dark is used in that artwork to sort of really, the subtlety is not Joseph Wright of Derby's middle name, to really show you that light and the Enlightenment, of a sort of intellectual awakening, so to speak. The Enlightenment thinkers really liked satire, so Voltaire also wrote Candide, and we have Jonathan Swift. We read A Modest Proposal, remember, in English, about, all these poor people. What should we do about it? I know, let's eat them. I don't know if you can remember that, but that's a good example of sort of satire. And he was mocking the sort of can-do attitude of some people, but also commenting on how ruthless people can be toward the poor, I think, as well. So let's see. So things change for children a little bit. Remember, not everybody embraces Rousseau's ideas on kids, but we do start to see a kinder attitude toward children after Rousseau writes Emile. He also argued that women shouldn't give their children off to wet nurses, that moms should nurse their babies themselves. And we start to see some people embracing these ideas. And we do see increasingly children not dressed like little adults, but allowed to wear sort of the looser clothing, and so that they can run around a little bit better, and more hugs for kids. And so we do see things changing for kids. We do see things changing for people of different religions, from Catholicism, increased toleration for sure. We do see things changing for people of color, but again, slowly, because remember, the French revolutionaries, they don't want to have any slavery on their colonies. But we also see it in England. In Britain, in 1807, the Parliament passes an act where England can't partake in the slave trade anymore. Wilberforce and his abolitionist society. So we do have that going on as well. So changing attitudes toward people of different colors happening. So lots of good things happening, but a largely male-dominated movement. And I think that's pretty much what you need to know about your Enlightenment and your enlightened rulers, consequences of the Enlightenment. So, so this week we'll be doing the agricultural revolution, going back in time a little bit, back to 1700 again, and doing the agricultural revolution as it bleeds into the industrial revolution, and then we'll be leading on from there. But I hope that you are studying a little bit and getting something out of these, but again, you can always watch them closer to the date. But I would think that if you only get one period, a good DBQ would be on the Enlightenment. So it's a good one to know quite well. And as we've been doing all of these change over timey type questions, you know, certainly the Enlightenment did change people's attitudes. They questioned, why have things always been this way? Can't we change society? Can't we make it more fair? Can't we have a better government? Can't we be kinder to people? Can't we be rational about this, etc.? So anyway, so happy studying, and I hope you have a good week, and I will send you another video next week. Bye.